Next month will be the interns picks, and that was partially inspired by this month's tour because I had the interns go out and pick native plants for me to talk about this time. So this is kind of the group. They did a good job. Without coordinating, they managed to get some plants from the West Coast, from the Deep South, a lot from the East. So a lot of different things that we'll talk about. Native plants are a little confusing. A lot of talk about native plants, but there are very few good definitions of native plants. And you really have to define what you're talking about when you're talking about native plants. Are those plants that were here when the first Europeans arrived, and where they are is where they're native when the first Europeans arrived? That's a lot of times what kind of the definition people use because we are so Eurocentric here. Are they the plants that where they were before the Ice Age? The Ice Age moved lots of plants down, and they are migrating back up still today. An example is Magnolia grandiflora. It grows wild up through Virginia, but really people say that, a lot of people say it's not native to Virginia, it's native farther south. Some people would even say it's not really native to North Carolina, or at least central North Carolina, because that's not where it was when the Europeans got here. So where exactly is Magnolia grandiflora native to? Another one is our geographic boundaries. I worked at a aquarium in Virginia. We had extensive nature trails, and the only criteria I had when I was hired there as horticulturist was the plants must be native to Virginia. This was a coastal garden. I would certainly argue that something like needle palm, which grows in North Carolina and has been at least apocryphally reported up into the Dismal Swamp and perhaps into Virginia, is more native than some of the plants from the mountains of Virginia. But I could plant plants from the mountains of Virginia. I couldn't plant something from coastal North Carolina that didn't cross that political boundary into Virginia. So there's a lot of buzzwords with native plants, and really we're taking a large approach. We're looking at North American native plants in this talk. So we got a little from all over when we talk about it, because plants don't understand that. And some of our native plants, that one in particular we'll talk about, and we'll mention it when we get there, is considered invasive in the U.S. outside of its native range. So just because something is native to North America doesn't mean it can't be a pest if it gets to a different spot. Any questions about that? It's a real thing with native plants, because people throw that word around, don't really define what they're talking about pretty often. All right, well, we'll jump right in there with an oak, one of my favorite groups of plants, right around the corner here. First plant is a Quercus oglethorpensis, which is native to the deep south, kind of South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, those areas. It is the champion Quercus oglethorpensis in Raleigh. So we probably have a lot of champion trees out here. Some of them are probably only 4 feet tall. There are probably a lot of our members who have been getting plants from us for many years who also have champion trees in their yards. We did this at another garden I worked at. We had somebody who was really into the champion trees and Virginia and the champion trees, and went through and measured all kinds of things that nobody else really had in Virginia, and we had lots of champion trees there. The Quercus oglethorpensis is a pretty large oak. It can grow 50 to 60 feet tall. It's a great source of, like many oaks, of food for wildlife. Both acorns for squirrels and deer and things like that, but also many of our native oaks are really good supporters of insect wildlife. There's a lot of Lepidoptera caterpillars that feed on oaks. They don't destroy them. It's not like a fall webworm or eastern tent caterpillars, but there are all those little skippers and flyers and things like that you see around, and moths and things are really supported by oaks. And a real interesting book called Bringing Nature Home by an entomologist who talks about the need for plants that support this diversity of insect wildlife. And he's got some charts in there on different plants and how many species of insects they support. And that's important for a diverse ecosystem. A lot of people say, ooh, I don't want insects in my yard. But we're not talking about pest type insects, but the insects that feed birds and kind of the basis for a lot of the food chain. And I will say even birds that eat seeds and nuts and berries and not nuts, but seeds and fruits and things like that are typically not insectivores. When they have young, almost all birds eat insects for that extra protein to feed to their young. So it is important. Like many plants in this this family, the Fagaceae family, it does tend to hold on to a lot of its leaves, especially when young. You'll notice young oaks tend to hold on to their leaves. Fagus tends to hold on to its leaves, and this does also. It turns a really lovely kind of russet, bronzy color in the fall, and will hang on to a lot of its leaves. And then by about the time the new leaves are emerging, it'll push off a lot of those old leaves. During really mild winters and deeper south, it'll stay kind of semi-evergreen. But one of many lovely oaks we have here.
Was Oglethorpe a botanist?
Somebody mentioned Oglethorpe. Tell me about Oglethorpe.
Oglethorpe was one of the founding people of Savannah, Georgia. He helped plan the city, and there are a lot of things named after him in Savannah.
Amanda picked this tree because she had a connection with Oglethorpe down in Savannah. So.
My dad used to live in Savannah.
So, there you go. And we didn't even set that question up to make our interns look good. Any other questions? Thoughts? All right. I'm going to head down to the xeric garden then. I want to mention, like always, if you see something while we're walking, I keep the list kind of short because often people have questions. If you see something you have a question about while we're walking, doesn't have to be about native plants, let me know. While I'm talking about a plant, if you have a different experience with it or want to add something or disagree with me, please do. Might have a wrong name. I'm going to talk about a Puncha alta, but I'm thinking maybe confused in here. This looks more like a Puncha alta back here. A Puncha alta is kind of an interesting plant. It's native just to a small area down in Texas and coastal Louisiana. The name's gone around all over the place. It's we have Puncha cross alta, which is kind of the current thinking in flora of North America. It's been listed as a species of Engleriana. Is that right? Engleriana? Engelmannii.
Yeah.
It's been listed as synonyms for several other plants. Flora North America has done a lot of work, and it's apparently a hexaploid hybrid with stricta and Engelmannii. It's probably the tallest of the North American opuntias. It can grow up to 12 or 15 feet tall, which is pretty good size for an opuntia around here, and does very well for us. And like I said, I'm pretty sure this is it. It's got deep yellow flowers, although it's somewhat variable as a hybrid. It can kind of cross the lines a little bit. Typically, with it's separated from closely related Lindheimeri by usually its anthers are yellow as opposed to the green in Lindheimeri, although that can shift a little bit in Alta. Opuntias, whether they're down in the southwest, even the moist southwest where this is native, or up here, are great wildlife plants. A lot of critters like to live in and around there, things that can navigate through the spines pretty easily because predators have a hard time getting in there. They do also form the prickly pears, for what it's named, big purple fruits, and all these where the flowers were. And the flowers go quickly. There'll be a bunch more flowers today, probably, but there were a bunch yesterday. Now they're gone. But every one of these where the flowers were will be a fruit, and you can peel those and eat them, and it's cool and refreshing. If they're pretty good. They're not real sweet. We're used to fruit that's been pretty well hybridized and sugar's really concentrated. It's not terribly concentrated sugar, but it's definitely refreshing, and if you add a little sugar to it, it's pretty good. You have to be careful. The fruits can have glotchids on them, which the pads can also. You know, people see these spines and that they stay away from because of the spines. The spines aren't really the part that'll bother you too much. The spines will jab you and they hurt, but the glotchids are little hook-like little guys that are down on there, and when those get in you, it's like fiberglass or something like that. They'll itch and they'll irritate for days. That really can be very difficult to get out. So when you do mess with prickly pears, you want to do it with some pretty thick gloves or something like that. And the fruits generally don't have too many of those, but they can have those. So you do want to handle them with care and get those peeled. If you get them under running some water, you know, you can kind of wipe them all off pretty easily on the fruits. People ask me about propagating these. They're really easy to propagate prickly pears. You just take a pad, let it dry out for a couple of days on a natural surface. Don't put it on plastic because it can rot, but on wood, on stone, on concrete, the ground, whatever. Let it dry for a few days, and then just stick it in the ground or stick it in a pot. Keep it moderately moist, water down then, and they will root. You know, these kind of spread because a pad will fall and root and start growing. So real easy. And this was in 2000. This was a pad. So this, I
think they all were.
I think they all came as pads. 2000. So that's pretty good growth. Questions or thoughts?
Mark,
disagreements?
is this the correct label here?
I don't believe it is.
Yeah, well,
Punch Exalta. Yeah, I got to go in and look at these.
I think you're correct. I took pictures of the flowers yesterday, and this one has like a pinkish one with yellow anthers, and then that one is
but
yellow.
I mean, it should be back there. Is there?
Well, I'm going to come through and
Okay.
double check. It is possible that we got this as a Puncha alta. It's a poorly understood species, and it may be wrong. I told you the information for a Puncha alta. I need to come in and do some looking at these and make sure. So,
Well, nobody
This
wants
one,
to
but
put the label back there anyhow.
well, from the other
Who's gonna
side, that little
throw
fatty.
it in there?
But we won't put this back on this one because this is pretty certainly. That.
New homework assignment.
If I weren't to tell you any confusion, I could point that out and say that's a Puncha alta, and there's nothing from what you see that would make you think otherwise, because it certainly looks like it. But we'll double check and make sure that certain that's what it is. If you're down in Southwest Louisiana or Southeast Texas on the coast, and you see a big tall Puncha, that's probably what it is.
Is that winter damage we see on this one?
Yeah, that's some winter damage. Got a little cold for it this past winter. But it'll grow out of that pretty quickly. The biggest problem with that is everywhere you get that, most of the time when you get that winter damage, you lose a lot of flowering. But I'm actually noticing on this one, instead of the flowers really being along the edge of the pads, we're getting some from farther down. Everywhere that you see the little cluster of spines, let me go back. A pad is, people think of them as leaves. They're not. They're stems. They're modified stems. Everywhere you see those little clusters of spines, that's where a leaf was. And you can see on the newest growth on these cacti, these kind of little round protuberances. And you only see this on young Opuntia pads. Those are leaves. Those little round things are leaves. They drop off early and the spines form. But all of those are buds, where those spines are buds. So if you have this winter damage, instead of having your flowers on the tips, which is where they normally are, you can see they can drop down and form on the sides of the pads, right there where those spines, glotches are, those buds. So it's just like pruning a plant, taking off that terminal bud that's growing. It'll break out a bud from another, from where a leaf is or where a node is somewhere else. Other thoughts, comments? Any Opuntia experts who can save me some headaches? American Beech, next one. A woefully underused tree, underplanted, Fagus grandifolia. Its European relative, Fagus sylvatica, is widely planted, lots of cultivars. See them been used in Europe at large estates. Now what you see a lot in the U.S. are the upright forms, the fastigiate forms, Franz Fontaine and some of the other ones in parking lots where they do very well because they're very tough trees and they don't spread out. So they fulfill the requirements the builders have of planting trees in the parking lot while still not providing much in the way of shade to any of the cars parked there, or to mitigate any of that heat from the parking lots. It's amazing how you can get around well-intentioned legislation. But this native tree, this is one of the larger trees in our forest. They can grow to up to 100 feet in the wild. You rarely see that in the U.S. But there are some really nice stands of large beeches in the U.S. because they're one of the hardest wooded trees in our forests. And when you were having to take trees down with axes and hand saws and things, this was a tough tree to take down. And so often in old clearings, everything would be removed except for the beeches. So a lot of times people think that beeches grow as pure stands. They really don't naturally. They're kind of the final succession in the forest. Something cut, there's fire, whatever. You have herbaceous material comes up, pines come up, maples come up, and kind of the last is the beech. And what that means, though, is that beech is one of the few shade trees that's very well adapted for shade. It will grow in shade better than most other shade trees will. So it makes it useful for those of us who have no more light in our gardens because we've planted them too much. And we still have to have another tree. So this is good for that. Yeah, this is, you see, this is the little beech nut on there. Beeches are in the same family as oaks. So a lot of wildlife likes these beeches. This is another one that supports a ton of wildlife, both mammals, birds, insects. It really is a kind of a pivotal species in terms of diversity. If you have two beeches, you want to know whether it's an American or a European, you can count the number of veins on the leaves, and that'll tell you. It has more veins, it's our native one. If it has fewer veins, it's the other ones. I can't remember the exact numbers. It's like 15 or something pairs for typical American, I think. They also are, all beeches are easily distinguished by their really smooth, beautiful bark. This is the bark that people like to carve their names in, and I guess was one until fairly recently in Kentucky that had Davy Crockett killed the bar in a date in the 1800s, and I think that piece of the tree is still preserved at some Liston Historical Society. I've seen a picture of it, I've never actually seen it. It's kind of interesting. But really a beautiful tree. They're mainly used now. They have this wonderful hardwood. They're great trees. They're beautiful plants. You know what their main use is? Pallets. They make pallets to ship a bunch of crap that we don't need all over the country and over the world out of these beautiful trees. Old, big, beautiful things. Because it's relatively light and it's very, very strong. Careful. Careful. At least if you're going to cut it down and make something out of it, make some beautiful piece of furniture that's going to last for, centuries, but no, pallets. There you go. Questions or thoughts?
Are they hard to transplant?
They're hard to transplant. I've never tried to transplant an American beech. This other beech, this Fagus lucida, which is an Asian beech, which is a little bit smaller, growing, we moved that when we planted this. We moved it from deep in here out to here, I believe. And it really didn't miss a beat at all.
They don't have a taproot or something, or not a big deal?
No, and most trees don't have a taproot per se. They'll often have a flare of roots, and they say in most trees 90% of the roots are in the top foot of soil, 95% in the top 3 feet. But what you'll often get, and beeches will do this. I have experience because one blew down on my neighbor's house from my yard in Atlanta. Like a lot of trees, you get their main root system comes out, but sometimes it'll go down another 2 feet with a pretty thick taproot, if you want to call it that, but not like a carrot. It'll come down and you'll get a second layer of roots underneath there, so it's almost like 2 layers of roots. And I don't know if that's in response to some environmental thing, because they don't all do that, but some trees will do that sometimes.
So that's no particular reason they're not offered in commerce that much, as far as you're concerned?
They're not quick growing trees, although they're not painfully slow either. But people aren't looking for shade trees, and when they are, they're mostly looking for very quick, which is why you see red maples for sale. Certainly not the best shade tree for us, but you don't see white oaks for sale, for instance, because people aren't planting trees in front of the homestead that their children and grandchildren are going to live in. They're going to live in their house for 5 years and then move. So why would you plant an oak or a beech on your tree? You know, there is no planting for posterity anymore.
Do they retain their leaves, the small ones?
Yes, thank you. This, like many oaks, this will retain a lot of its leaves in the fall. They're really a lovely tan color. I think they're beautiful in the winter, and they add a lot of interest. We have lots of nice evergreen things, which is lovely. But you have evergreen things, you have the bare branches of trees, and then you have kind of the tans on a lot of these oaks and oak relatives. I think it really adds to the winter diversity.
You asked about transplanting. I had my best luck taking small ones from the woods in the spring, not in the fall.
Before they leaf out there? Or?
Before they leave out, early spring. I've had the best results.
Yeah.
Do I remember that it looks similar to a hornbeam? And how do you tell the difference between the two?
Yeah,
Something about the leaf size?
it does look similar to a hornbeam. The leaf is on Fagus is a little bit more serrate, typically, which gives it kind of that wavy look to it. It's wider. When they get larger, their Fagus is a much bigger plant. Also, kind of on a medium-aged tree, a young tree where they could be the same size. Hornbeams, you get a lot of this. See how smooth this is? Hornbeams are smooth, but it's almost like muscles. They're kind of twisted and I don't know what the word is. Sinewy. You know, that kind of. It really does look like something very, very organic.
Looks like muscles.
There is another reason this isn't grown and offered widely is, unlike the European beech, there are basically no cultivars. There is American beech and that's it, except for the one that we have in our nursery, the dwarf weeping beech. It's looking great.
Is it planted yet, or is it still?
It's not planted, it's still in a container.
So it's looking good though?
It got beat up a little bit in the storm, but that's okay. That's not a health issue. That just tore up the leaves a little bit and stuff swirling around. So that's not a health issue with the plant. I mean, it doesn't look great, but it's not a health thing.
It's growing new leaves.
Exactly.
It's pretty tough.
Exactly. Questions or thoughts? All right, we'll move down this way. Now, you know, we love our red buds here. We have a national collection of red buds. This is easily one of our favorites, floating clouds. And as I talk about this, I want you to look at this plant and this plant, which are these are both silver clouds. These were kind of the original variegated red buds. And as you look at the two, you can see quite a bit of difference between them. Cercis canadensis goes throughout much of the eastern United States. It kind of morphs into a Texas form, which has thicker, glossier leaves as you get down in the southwest. And there's a Mexican species and a West Coast species, Cercis occidentalis, Cercis mexicana, that are also, kind of all part of this same group. Although the Cercis occidentalis, the western species, really has more in common with the Asian species than with these eastern, while the eastern species kind of similar down through the eastern United States, Canada, all the way down into the Mexican species. Those all kind of merge into each other. Most people are from this area at least somewhat familiar with red buds. In the spring, you get wonderful magenta flowers. If that's the wrong color, then sue me, I'm not good with colors. Bright pink, purpley pink flowers. Small tree, very kind of a graceful form, these arching branches. Different species do have somewhat of a different architecture to them. Did I put Ace of Hearts on here? Oh, I missed one. There's another plant on here that I missed that we'll have to get on here. Another red bud. But lovely plants. Now this plant, this variegated plant, kind of the first one was this silver cloud behind us. And silver cloud is an okay plant. It was great when it came out because there really wasn't anything else like it. When it emerges in the spring, it is just white. And you can see some of the new growth, very, very white. And then it goes to green, which is good because otherwise it'll burn. And you can see some older leaves that are more white on there that are starting to get some burning on the edges there where it's out in full sun. Floating clouds comes out and it does not burn, and it comes out almost pure green, and then it goes white later in the season, which I like a lot. My feeling is always things that do things later in the season are great because we have so many spring flowering plants. There's so many things that are showy in the spring that it's nice to get something moving into early summer, midsummer. This seems to be a more vigorous grower. It's a little more sun tolerant. It's very sun tolerant. It's more sun tolerant than silver cloud. And by the end of the season, I mean, it's just gorgeous. Kind of yellowish fall color, not spectacular, but nice. A nice winter bark on there, I think. But just all around a nice tree. What's very interesting is, to me anyway, is if you sow out seedlings of silver cloud, they will all be green. It's a recessive trait, the variegation in there. You can get a second generation and get some variegation in there. Floating clouds appears to be dominant. When you sow seedlings of floating clouds, you get variegated plants. Rarely do you get them as nice as floating clouds, but you do get variegated plants. So it's kind of interesting that they do work that way. Questions or thoughts? Sun to shade, seem to get a little bit better color in sun. Pretty tough tree once established.
I'm noticing from down here that there aren't a whole bunch of leaves filling in under the canopy. Is there a name for that kind of architecture that's more like an umbrella?
There are names for trees that are umbrella shaped, umbraculiform, but not really so much the way the leaves are sitting in the tree like this. You wouldn't really call this a tree like this that form. I don't know, there may very well be, but you can also see there's been some pruning on the inside here to open it up a little bit.
So this comes back from seeds then?
Well, not the one you're holding on to.
I know.
It comes...
It's a variety that comes from seeds?
No. If you sow seed, you will get some level of variegation from seedlings. They'll all be different, but floating clouds is a grafted variety. Yeah, it comes back from graft.
Was it found in the wild or spread?
You know, I'm not sure. Somebody told me it's from Don Shadow, in Tennessee. Somebody told me it's a seedling from silver cloud, but I don't believe that. It's because it's a different genetic variegation. It's a different thing. So I don't believe that it's a seedling from floating cloud. But I don't know. It was probably a branch sport, a mutation on a branch.
Do you know if Dennis Werner is trying to get a purple leaf variegated one?
Oh yeah.
He is?
And he's on his way there.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Oh, great.
Does it propagate by cutting?
Cercis canadensis is virtually impossible from my experience and everything I've read from cutting. It's a grafted plant. Some of the other cercis will root. You might be able to get some small percentages if you do a lot of them. And maybe if you figured out the right day of the year to take your cuttings and stick them, and you got the right weather that day. But no, they're pretty much cercis are seed or grafted. Real interesting though, they do bud grafts. They don't graft, like you do with Japanese maples, where you get one, kind of a branch and graft it on a rootstock. These are mostly grown in the field. You line them, you sow the seed or plant out seedlings in the field, let them grow for a year, and then you put one bud, so you take a bud stick, say something like this, And you take the buds from it all in late summer, early fall, when the bark slips. You cut a little T-notch in your rootstock, put that little bud in there. Some people leave the top of it, some people whack off the top of the rootstock. And in a year, by the end of the next year, you will have trees that are over your head. And like in Tennessee, where they do a lot of these, and it's amazing the growth they get out of these plants. But you remember, you got a whole root system there that's established in the field. That's all pushing all its the water and minerals up into the top of that plant, and so it's all set to go that next spring when it goes. And man, it just the growth is astounding to me, and pretty good caliper on them in a year.
So rootstock is just regular surface, right?
This rootstock's just seedling, yeah.
What diseases affect the red buds?
What diseases affect the red buds? There are some cankers you get occasionally, but you don't get a whole lot of diseases on there. And if somebody else has more experience with that, they can tell me. In my experience, not a whole lot of disease. Every once in a while, you get a leaf spot. Has some insects. There are some. There's a little caterpillar that'll get in there, and kind of where leaves overlap, they'll lay their eggs. The larvae will get in there and kind of makes a webbing and holds it together, and they'll eat out on the inside. If you open it up, they're all nasty in there. A lot of frass, that sort of thing.
I've got one that's it's like red, it's like a rust colored burns, I guess. I don't know if it's burns or disease or I don't know what that would be.
I don't know, it sounds fungal, but I'm not sure. Anybody have experience with that? No. We can look into that.
So Mark, if you get a branch that suddenly dies, is that probably canker? Or
That's probably a canker. Yeah.
cut it off?
Yeah, just cut it off.
Yeah.
Sterilize your pruners afterwards, prune saw, whatever. Cut it back a good 6 inches to a foot beyond where it's dead.
Are they readily available?
Floating clouds is out there. It's definitely being produced in big numbers. I don't know locally if it's easy. Does anybody go to garden centers more than me?
I've heard it's been available.
Homewood has a lot of different things.
Homewood, yeah, and they're usually pretty good. I always say I'm terrible about knowing what's available locally because I go to wholesale growers a lot and deal with them and try and get them growing new plants so they can get to the retails, and I don't always make it to the retails to see what's actually out there. Sometimes I'm very surprised when I go there and pleased with what they're growing. Often. All right, head on up to the rooftop. Our native trumpet creeper, and I mentioned at the beginning that there are some native plants that, when they grow out of their native range, are considered, people often say invasive. I don't know that people always know what invasive means or have a definition for invasive. We won't go in there, we'll stay with natives. I won't go into that part. But this can be a real pest if you get some places in the Northeast beyond its native range. I got to put its native range here, yeah, east and south central U.S., kind of widespread. Trumpet creeper, see it flowering along the sides of the roads now, on old fences, up on trees. It's the vine that's got the big orangey red flowers on it right now. This is one called apricot. There's one that was found in the wild here in North Carolina that we just have as Bahama yella because it was found near Bahama. And if you call it Bahama yella, it's not, even though we spell it Y-E-L-L-O-W, you got to say yella because you're saying Bahama. And this is flava, which is kind of the standard yellow flowered form. Flava means yellow. I'm not sure where the origin of apricot is. I think it's South Carolina, but I'm not certain of that. I will say in Texas, I took some cuttings of a yellow flowered form that was out in the wild, and as I look at these three, which I can't tell the difference between, I'm thinking, boy, it looks an awful lot like all three of these. You keep thinking that it'll be different, but generally it isn't. And so really, flava, these are probably all flava. Maybe it should be Campsis radicans, forma flava, just a yellow form, because it seems like this yellow form is maybe a recessive trait in there. It maybe pops up here and there in the wild. Like I said, I saw one in Texas, this one North Carolina, South Carolina. Flava, who knows, that's an old one, I don't know where it came from, but they all seem to be pretty much identical. The yellow ones tend to be a little slower growing than the species. That's a relative term. The species is incredibly fast growing. They are big vines. You plant them if you have a carport that's falling down and you don't want to take it down, you plant it and let it grow over that, and then you have a big beautiful mound of green with flowers on it, and they are really, really vigorous plants. They grow quickly. And they do hold on, vines hold on different ways. These do have rootlets at the nodes, so they are self-clinging at the nodes, and you can see that if you get up close, you can see where it's holding on some. They don't cling as well as, say, ivy or Virginia creeper or something like that, but they will climb on their own, and they'll twine and twist and go kind of every which way. I grew up in a house with a huge sycamore in the front yard, and it's had campsis growing on it as long as I can remember. The campsis trunk now is probably this big around, and it's beautiful when it flowers, coming out of the top of the sycamore as the sycamore leaves are all falling from leaf spot and rust. Grows full sun or shade. It actually, the foliage is nicer and it grows better if it's shaded some, especially at the base, but it flowers best in sun, and that's how it grows naturally. It grows up through trees and at 20 feet, 30 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet. It kind of erupts from the top and flowers up there, and the butterflies and hummingbirds hit it up high on the tops of trees and on the outsides of the trees, but it's shaded underneath. It'll grow in more sun and do well, but that is how it's happiest. Questions? Usually at this point I get the question, how do you get rid of it? It's actually not too bad to get rid of. You cut it and put some Roundup on it or something along those lines. It will sucker underground. You will get it popping up in other spots. The yellow form, again, does not seem to do that quite as much as the typical orangey red forms.
How deep is the soil there?
The soil here is pretty much the whole root top is between 4 and say 14 inches. This is probably somewhere in the 8 to 10 inch range. See it popping up over here.
Well, just for wood siding, I mean, I know maybe you're not a builder by profession, but does it over time do any or much damage to
For wood siding?
if it comes to that for a long enough period of time?
Really no. Let me go. It doesn't do much in terms of damage to things. People are terrified of the roots of things going in, but these little rootlets don't form big, deep roots. They kind of just cling on to the outside. There are different types of roots. This does have the kind of root that will go in. Some things like, say, Virginia creeper, if you look at their little rootlets, they actually have little, almost like, looks like suction cups on the end, and they just sit on the outside. They don't do any damage. The damage you can get with siding, anything that's not a pretty solid surface, is if they can go in between there, that's where you have your problems. Other questions? All right, we'll keep moving. One of our favorite groups of plants here, group of plants we've been growing for a long time, are calicarpas, the beauty berries. And there are several variegated forms out on the market, mostly the Asian ones. This is a variegated form of our native beauty berry, Calicarpa americana. This one's berries and cream. Great little name. Calicarpa is native to the southeast. You go down in Georgia and places like that, they'll tell you Calicarpa americana is a ditchweed, which it is. It grows up, big plants. Beautiful plant though. This plant, variegated foliage, very irregularly splashed with white. Some, you get some growth that's almost pure white. Some that's a little less splashed. As temperatures get hot, it'll tend to go more towards green, and towards the end of the season, it's mostly green, not entirely green. Couldn't have timed that better, right? It'll get little lavender flowers. It's starting to form flowers now. You can see all the little leaf axils. There's little clusters of flowers. And then it'll form fruits. And if you've never seen beautyberry fruits, you got to come back and look at our beautyberries in the fall. The beautyberries form these little kind of, on Americana, maybe BB-sized fruit that are just the glossiest purple that you've ever seen. Just absolutely stunning color. Really beautiful thing. People are amazed at their actual plants. I've seen them in cut flower arrangements. They're very short-lived as cut flowers, especially Americana. But I've seen that where they, people have said, you know, are those real? Is that plastic? And I always, you know, want to pick them and see what they are because they look really unreal. This has been cut back. Calicarpa americana is a large shrub. The Asian ones tend to be a little bit more refined, many of them, not all of them. The ones that are grown tend to be a little more refined. This does get big, it has big leaves. This was cut back this winter. You could let it go, it can get to be 8 or 10 feet tall and almost as big across. Just kind of big leaves, big plant. Or you can cut it back every year and let it flush back out every year. It'll flower and fruit every year if you cut it back during the winter, so you can keep it restrained. As a mature plant, if you cut it back every year, you're still going to get to 4 to 6 feet, depending on the whether how much moisture, how much sun, everything gets. Very shade tolerant. Like many things, flowering, fruiting tends to go down a little bit in the shade, but it will grow well in the shade. It will grow in really boggy conditions, but will also grow in drier soils. If it's very dry and it's in a fairly sunny spot, you can get some burn on the leaves, but otherwise pretty easy, hard to kill. You know, I have no idea. Wait, no, I take that back. Now right in here, I looked this up when I was doing this. This came from, it's not in here, Harp's Mill Nursery, which is a retail nursery, and apparently it's something that they found. I think it's maybe in South Carolina. If you get in touch, I can tell you for sure. But we actually did have a note in our records about that it was found by this nursery. Really, what you probably want to do is go into introducing new plants. This is interesting. It's not really a commercial plant because it's so irregular, it's not stable, and you often hear breeders talk about stabilizing the chimera. This is a chimeral variegation. You want to stabilize it. So what you do is you come in, you find something that looks good, that's looking like it might be stable. Like sometimes these splashes like this can be stable. You know, this isn't gonna, if you propagate from down here and it stays this white, and I don't know if all y'all can see this, I'll pull off a leaf, but a whole branch that's like this probably isn't gonna grow. There's not enough chlorophyll. But something like this, you know, maybe you can keep doing cuttings of that and keep taking the best parts of that until eventually you get something that's stable, that won't revert. Sometimes it never happens with plants. Sometimes you can. This looks like the type of plant where that would probably never happen. So I don't know that it'd be great, but you could try that. Another native plant that's not on this list, but the no, I'm sorry. I was gonna tell you about a plant. That's not true. I'm telling you why. But some plants, I've seen plants that have kind of a gold speckled variegation on there, and you keep doing cuttings on that on the goldest parts until you get an entire gold leaf that's completely stable. It doesn't revert. And there are people who do that pretty readily. I was thinking Pat McCracken. I was thinking he told me that he did that with his Myrica Soleil, but that's not the case. It was a different plant.
This one seed everywhere. Do all those
does
berries
this one
germinate?
seed everywhere? No, this one does not seed everywhere for us. Calicarpas can seed around quite a bit. Some of the Asian ones can be a real nuisance. Calicarpa americana, if it's very happy, can seed around a bit. But I think the seedlings are pretty easy to pull, so they don't bother me. I've heard people say that they can be real garden thugs.
What's that to your left there that's getting ready to flower?
This is a lily.
Is it lily?
Yep. We have no idea which one.
Oh, it's fun then, just to wait till it opens.
Well, I mean, we haven't known what it is for ages.
Oh.
I don't know what the origin of this particular one was, but it may have been something that was planted and kind of forgot about. And we're pretty good with our labels and everything, but occasionally there's something. Or it could be that we received it as something, it flowered, it was not what we had thought it was going to be, and we haven't been able to figure out what it is. But it is labeled Lilium. Any other questions? All right. This is one of our signature trees here, and it's shown up on a couple of tours previously, so you may have heard me speak about it. But it is a favorite of plants, of the collections here at the Arboretum. This is a weeping winged elm, almost alata, lace parasol. JC named it for its beautiful habit here. Some confusion about its origin. This is the original plant. All of the plants come from this. This was dug and brought here when it was about 8 feet tall or so. I've heard two kind of conflicting accounts about it. In the first account, this was found about, well, I guess now about 55 years ago. I might have right there. And in the woods, and was grown at somebody's house for a while, and then I believe they passed away, and the new owners of the house called the Arboretum and asked about it, and JC came out and convinced them to let him have it, and brought it here from Person County. This was in Person County. Another report from somebody else who's a very knowledgeable person who says that some people bought a house in Orange County not nearly so long ago, and this was growing wild there, they think, or may have been cultivated, but nobody knows, and it was brought here. But either way, it was brought to the Arboretum and distributed from the Arboretum. Winged elms are one of the main elms you see in the woods around here. If you go out, you can find winged elms pretty much all over. Yeah, you can see the range, Maryland to Illinois to Kansas to Florida and Texas, so pretty wide ranging tree. It's a slow-growing, this form, lace parasol, slow-growing weeping tree. You can see it's gotten pretty big over time, but if this were a typical winged elm and the age that it is, it'd be 40 feet tall, 50 feet tall right now. Gets its name winged elm from the little wingy, quirky protuberances on the stems. Very not so noticeable during the summer when the leaves are on there, but during the winter it is a pretty interesting aspect to it, and it goes all the way back on the fairly old foliage. The leaves can get a little rough looking during the summer, especially here in full sun. You often see young plants growing in some shade in the woods. But it's got this wonderful form, and during the winter it is absolutely breathtaking when you can see in there and see that great bark. And you can see that a little bit. We try and keep it cleared out enough to see a little bit of that form in there, and just really a nice shape. Before the leaves come out, it flowers and it starts fruiting, and it gets these little flat samaras, kind of almost a fringe around the edge. And if you come out in the morning in the early spring before it leaves out, the sun's shining through it from over here. It looks like it's covered in ice. You get this just this glow around every little bit on there. It's really really beautiful. And if you're a photographer, you should come out and take a picture of that. Despite being a dwarf plant, it's not slow growing. If you look at this season's growth right here, what's that? 2.5 feet of growth in one season. So it does grow vigorously. Just doesn't grow tall because it's weeping. It does root, which is many weeping plants are very difficult to root, but this does root pretty readily, which means we've been able to distribute it. It doesn't have showy flowers, so it's got limited appeal to mass market, but certainly for those people with a more refined sense of taste, it's a beautiful plant. Questions or thoughts?
Light resistance.
Pardon?
Light resistance.
Blight resistance. It's fairly resistant, although it gets quite a few other things, some rusts and leaf spots and things like that. It is susceptible to Dutch elm disease, but not quite as susceptible as like Ulmus americana, as evidenced by the fact that it still exists in the wild. Other questions? All right. Sequoia sempervirens. One of the interns kindly picked a plant from the West Coast so we could have some real cross-country natives. We're very Catholic in our terms of cross-country of native. We like the whole U.S. We're patrons. Sequoia sempervirens is native to northern California and Oregon, the cool regions of California. Coastal areas, and it's kind of interesting that one, that this will grow here because it's such a different climate from us, but it's also interesting to see how different it is here as opposed to where it's native to. Much smaller tree. Old sequoias here will never attain the height they get in the Pacific Northwest, and there are a lot of reasons for that. One theory at least is that those nice cool fogs which roll in every day help to keep the tops of the trees hydrated. Whereas here you don't have that, and they just never will get there. They'll get to a certain height, and then you'll start with the redwoods having the tops dying out a bit, flattening out, and you'll get, the top will die, and another shoot will go up and try and get taller, and then that'll die. It's just you can't pump water up that high. If you're a hydraulic engineer, if you know a hydraulic engineer, ask them what it takes to move water to the top of a 300-foot building. And I'll tell you, that's one of the most difficult engineering problems. It's one of the things that really restricts the height that we go, is that you can't get water too high. Water's heavy. It's hard to get up. So a lovely evergreen plant. It has almost plasticky needles on it, which are very cool, very resistant to a lot of things. Will grow in some shade, and of course sun. You can see this one's up in the sun, doing well. One of the things that's really nice when you get a large tree is this great shaggy reddish bark on there. It can be so attractive. It's for the size that it gets here. As I said, it doesn't get huge. It has kind of a strong presence with that dark foliage, that kind of a stout trunk. There's something about them that once they get over about maybe say 8 or 10 years, there's the look of kind of age to them. They all of a sudden start looking like they've been there a long time, even though they're not huge. Whereas something like, say, a cryptomeria that's the same height just doesn't give you, as lovely as that is, nothing to knock that, just doesn't give you that sense of age and permanence that the coastal redwoods do. And they do grow pretty well. They need some moisture when they're young to really get going, and during droughts they appreciate some extra moisture. Really cold winters, if you get them from really coastal areas and more southern areas, cold winters can do them in when they're young, but once they grow past 3 or 4 years, they're generally not so much of a problem. But lovely plants. Questions? I should say the sequoia dendron, the giant redwood, does not do nearly so well. Some of the dwarf forms and creeping forms of sequoia dendron will grow all right, but the upright forms just do not do like sequoia.
You have several. Are they all the same cultivar here?
They're not all sequel, and I can't remember what it's. I think that's just location, but the one over here is just Sequoia sempervirens. It's an unnamed form.
There's a glauca. Isn't there a small one sort of over by the big willow oaks?
There's one called Aptos Blue.
Okay,
That's a really nice blue one. And that Aptos Blue is, it is blue. It's a nice plant.
Did you ever hear about these being raised commercially for wood in the east?
No.
Because I remember 20 years ago, probably, I was down at, I think it was either Middleton or Magnolia Plantation near Charleston, and the owner was touting these were going to be the next great tree, better than cypress or pine. Of course, apparently not.
Yeah, I think the wood would be good. I think the speed is they just don't grow fast enough. And if you're planting most lumber production, you're putting out seedlings. You got one person who's planting 1,000 a day. These just aren't you're gonna have too high mortality with these as young plants, I think, in the southeast. All right, we'll move on. Next is this honey locust. Isn't this nice? They just have honey locusts growing all along the sides of the roads, kind of passing by without a second thought, even when they're in flower. This is a great little weeping form of our honey locust, Ladizia triacanthus, variety inermis, emerald cascade, spelled with a K for some reason that drives me crazy. There's no need to be cutesy with it when you have a nice plant. Variety inermis means thornless. If you've ever dealt with honey locusts, they can have just vicious thorns. Can be really nasty, but this is a thornless variety. Emerald cascade, of course, weeping, a dwarf weeping form. This time of year and in the early spring, it's a lovely plant. Has this nice graceful form. New growth is a little reddish. It's nice and kind of emerald green. Good name for it. and grows well. Larger plants, I don't know if this one has ever flowered, larger plants of Emerald Cascade will flower. You get clusters of little white honey-scented flowers. You look around during kind of late spring, early summer for honey locust flowering out in the wild, and you just see, a lot of what you see driving along the side of the road is honey locust. And when they're all covered in white, you can roll down your car windows. Look at that, I'm old-fashioned. You roll down your car windows. You can roll down your car windows and take a whiff if you're stuck on 40, and they're flowering out there because it's really nice. This plant, like a lot of honey locusts, can look a little ratty as you get later in the summer. This particular one will generally lose all of its leaves by late summer. It's got some fall webworm issues, some other problems with insects, and some other leaf diseases. Probably part of what keeps it a little dwarfer, but it doesn't really affect the plant. It comes out every year just fine. Just by August, it looks pretty darn rough until all the leaves will finally drop completely and it's bare. Honey locusts are about the toughest plant there are. They will, you see them along fence rows, and the reason for that often is that the wood from honey locust is incredibly hard and long-lasting and rot-resistant. So people use them as fence posts. But you can take a piece of honey locust that's been laying around, something this size that's been laying around for weeks and weeks and months sometimes, and stick it in the ground, and if it's moist enough, it will root and start growing. In fact, in some areas, missionaries used honey locust as kind of their walking sticks, and if the natives were particularly difficult to convert, they would sometimes plant them and pray over them and have them emerge. Gotta admit that I have heard that from several different sources. I've never actually confirmed that happened, but it's a great story, so I will pass it on. Your guy's more powerful if he can do real magic. But they are very difficult to kill, very long-lived. In general, honey locusts are not necessarily specimen trees, not beautiful plants, but they're really tough. But when you get the weeping forms or the gold leaf forms, they really have a lot to offer. Questions or thoughts about honey locusts? You can tell it's hot. The questions go downhill as it gets hotter and hotter. Okay. Hydrangea arborescens Annabelle. This is our native hydrangea. There's also Hydrangea corsifolia, which grows farther south than us, but native to North Carolina is Hydrangea arborescens. You see this growing in the woodlands, especially up in the mountains, often growing on really pretty steep slopes, often with a little seat down there where they get a little bit of water, but this is one of the more drought-tolerant hydrangeas that are out there, Hydrangea arborescens. I don't know why it's called Hydrangea arborescens. Arborescens kind of implies that it's tree-like, more woody, whereas it's really one of the least woody of the hydrangeas that we grow. Annabelle is this wonderful mop-head form. It is the standard to which all other Hydrangea arborescens are put. It's been around for a long time. There are other ones. There's grandiflora, which has really huge heads that flop. Hydrangea Annabelle tends to stay fairly upright. With more moisture, it can get to have even bigger heads. But I mean, I think this is one of those plants that's been around, and Annabelle, and people are always looking for the new thing. But when you look at this, a deep green foliage, those wonderful flower heads, I mean, those are the right size. To get too much bigger than that, and you start looking a little, it's like somebody having a 15-carat diamond on. A little, just looks out of place on anybody. For people who don't know what to do with their hydrangeas, do I cut it back? Do I not cut it back? What do I do? These are easy. You can cut it back to the ground. It'll come back up, and it'll flower for you every year. In fact, the stems mostly die back to the ground. You have to cut it back every winter. It's best in some shade. You put it out in full sun, and it'll really wilt every afternoon. It'll perk back up by the morning, but it will kind of look sad every afternoon. The flowers will go over quick. If you want to cut hydrangeas to bring inside, I don't know that arborescens are your best to do that because they have thinner stems. But if you do like bring them inside with this or with any other hydrangea, what you want to do is get it when the flowers are just beginning to open up, when it's still not showing its full color. And you can either hang it in a dark, warm room, or you can throw them in a box kind of spread out in the trunk of your car and let them bake for a couple of days in your trunk, and they'll generally, you get that great dried flowers. Questions?
And I guess obviously the different colorations are due to the soil.
Well, hydrangea arborescens is not, it's white. It's white. There are some pink forms, but those are all derived from, there are some wild forms that have, with a lace cap, that have kind of pink in the center of the lace cap. The fertile flowers are pink to them, and they've kind of bred those together to develop some pink ones, pink mophead ones, including one from NC State, Invincible Spirit, that are pink. But hydrangea arborescens does not go blue. There's nothing you can do about it. Now, hydrangea macrophylla, the typical big leaf hydrangea, that has to do with acidity. The blue is from aluminum in the soil. So the aluminum in the soil is readily available when your soils are acid. So if you plant them in our native natural soil, hydrangeas, big leaf hydrangeas will tend to be blue because we have very acidic soils. Now, a lot of potting mixes are very acidic, but may not have any aluminum in there. So you can have a very acidic soil and still have a pink hydrangea because you don't have that aluminum in there to support it. So sometimes people will actually buy a hydrangea that's pink, put it in the ground, it'll turn blue right away. Now, if you have a pink hydrangea and you want it to turn blue, it's easy to do. You put down aluminum sulfate around it, and it'll pick up that aluminum unless your soil is just incredibly basic. That's turn it blue. If you want to turn it pink, then you lime it, because then you'll lower your pH, and even though the same amount of aluminum is in your soil, it becomes less available. I need a chalkboard to show how the ions do their thing on the you don't want that. But that's what it is. So if you want blue, you want acidity and aluminum. If you want pink, you want your soils to be basic. But not with hydrangea arborescens. Any questions?
The yellow leaf on the White Perfection camellia, is there any chance at all that would survive if you took a cutting and tried to root it?
There is probably a slim chance that it would survive. But you know what I have found is that sometimes when you take, growers say that won't survive. There's no chlorophyll, there's no good. But not all plants stay white. As we talked about the calocarpa changing color. We looked at the cercis. Now those weren't solid, but there are plants that are, and I never can remember if it's virescent or albescent. I think albescent means they start green and they go white, and virescent means they start white and go green, although I could have those backwards. I look them up about once every 2 months and they just won't stick which one it is. But this could be a plant that comes out white and then will go green, especially if it's got to put its own roots on there. Now, will it be stable? I don't know. Camellias we'll send those out pretty often, and typically they don't, but it's always worth trying. It doesn't hurt anything to take a cutting and stick it. Maybe next time y'all are taking cuttings, y'all can try that one.
I think viridescent means going green, and iridescent means going showier.
Okay. That's kind of how I think viridescent goes from white to green or yellow to green. Albescent going from green to white. Yeah. Okay. That's what I always think, but I'm never sure. I never want to say it authoritatively because that's too easy to check. The things that are hard to check, I can say with authority. Okay, the bonus plant is a redbud. Yay! Told you we love our redbuds. This is Cercis canadensis, Ace of Hearts, and this may be my favorite redbud, and it's not even variegated. Ace of Hearts is a dwarf form, small leaves, very, very heart-shaped. Some of the leaves are rounder on some plants. This is very, very heart-shaped. Small flowers, but they're held masses. It's not the showiest red bud in flower, but it is nice. But what I really like about this plant is how the leaves are held. There's just something about this plant that is tidy, it's neat, it's very interesting. If you look over here, not all the way to the right, but kind of under this maple and through there, there's another little leaf form called Tom Thumb. And if you look at the comparison between the two as dwarf plants, this is a much nicer plant in my mind. It's got thicker leaves, darker green, and they're arranged so perfectly on the plant. The only other redbud really that I know of that arranges its leaves like this is Flame, the big double flower one with large leaves, but it holds the leaves at this particular angle. And our NC State and resident Cercis breeder and former director Denny Werner, I know at some point, we talked about this quite a bit, at some point had a graduate student, and I hate to have been her, measuring angles on the leaves of red buds to try and quantify, you gotta love scientists, try and quantify what made this so appealing. Because when you point this out to people, people generally do find this very almost ranked appearance to be very satisfying. But in other respects, grow it like other red buds, full sun. This one is very, very sun tolerant, very tough. You can grow it in shade, makes a wonderful small tree. It's dwarf, but it's not terribly slow growing. A small plant will not take a lifetime to get to be a halfway decent size. Questions about that? I had to finish in the sun. And Denny is working with some of the gold ones, the purple ones, and the variegated ones.
What was the findings of the graduate student?
I don't know. Inconclusive, I think. That or she dropped out. I don't know.
Is that one of your authoritative answers that are hard to look up?
All right. Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for a great tour.
If you have any other questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.